Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about introducing your animals to the eShepherd virtual fencing system and how to get them trained to respond correctly. So we've got a demo property set up here where we're going to describe a few scenarios. Here we are zoomed in on the yards and you can see there are some green triangles here. These are unfitted neckbands ready to go onto animals. Once we've gone through a process called neckband association, that's where we put a neckband on an animal and associate it with one of the traits of the animal, like its visual identification tag or its electronic identification tag, then these green triangles will convert to a round icon and it'll become an animal in the list over here, and we're ready to do some virtual fencing with them. And we'll jump over into that scenario in a moment and show you. So for this purpose, I've set up a number of training virtual paddocks to facilitate the discussion. So I'll zoom out a little bit. So for this demonstration, we're going to assume that the animals are coming out of the yards and they kind of come into this paddock here, and we're going to do the training in this physical paddock. So the basic principle is for any physical paddock really is that we want to try and split it up into 2/3 of an inclusion zone and 1/3 of an exclusion zone. So I'll show you what I mean and how we might set that up. So I'm going to unhide this training paddock and I'm going to highlight it so we can talk about it. So I've created a virtual paddock that has a boundary that runs right through the paddock here. So roughly there's 1/3 of the paddock is an exclusion zone and 2/3 of it are an inclusion zone. And I've gone all the way outside and around the yards as well, and I'll explain why I've done that in a minute. So you can see some of the virtual fence boundaries are laid over the top of the physical fences, so that's running down along here and all the way along here. The virtual fence is on top of the physical fence, and this segment here has no physical backups at all, so it's just in the middle of the paddock, so animals will have to learn how to negotiate this without any visual clues. So that's a very typical setup. Now the 2/3 and 1/3 is a little bit of a rule of thumb. You don't have to follow that exactly. All that we are trying to do is limit the amount of area that animals have in the exclusion zone. So if some of them do end up breaking out and spending time out here, they do find themselves back inside the virtual fence at some point, at which time their training can resume. So this is one setup. Now let's have a look at some other options that we can do, and we may be able to do this, some of these other options during the training period. So the one that I'm showing now is probably the most simple scenario. So let's try and set up some slightly different scenarios, and I'll turn this one on and hide the other one. So this one here is basically the same virtual fence, but we've offset the virtual fence boundaries from the physical fence. We've brought them inside the virtual paddock, and we've done the same along here and along here. So this is a good way to accelerate the learning of the animals, as they will now have more opportunity to interact with the virtual fence. And there is a physical fence in near proximity, so really the only choice that they have is to turn back and end up inside the virtual fence. So this just helps them again reinforce that behavior of when you hear the audio tones, you need to turn around and come back into the virtual fence to prevent getting the pulse. And then again, sometime later in the training period, what we might do is close off still further parts of the virtual paddock. So in this case now we've cut off bits that used to go back to the yards and shut off this part of the paddock here. And again, now they've just got another opportunity to interact and learn how this virtual fence boundary works. And you might do this on day 4 or 5, and then still another consideration that we might have to think about is where our watering points are. So if our watering points are somewhere along a physical fence, then we certainly don't want to have the virtual paddock as we've set it up here. This would prevent them from being able to get access to the watering trough. So if that's the case, then we'd want to have a nice big area away from that virtual fence so they don't get any stimulus as they come into water. Okay, so now that we've discussed a few of these training scenarios, let's have a look at an example of what that might look like. Once you have put your neck bands on animals, then they will show up as these blue icons do, right? So in this case, we have fitted them to the animals and we've chosen blue as the mob color. Then once we are ready to let the animals come out into the paddock, we can turn on this virtual fence that we've drawn, or we can choose to leave it turned off. Now, one of the reasons why we might choose to leave it off is because sometimes when you introduce your animals back into a new paddock that they haven't been in for a while, they want to go for a run and they want to go all the way to the extents of the paddock. And if the virtual paddock is already turned on in a scenario like this, then they'll all charge across that virtual fence line. They won't know what the audio tones are all about, and they'll all get pulsed and they all get a little bit confused, and it'll be quite a rude introduction to virtual fencing. So that's one reason not to do that. But if you are quite confident your animals will enter the paddock calmly, then you can have the virtual fence already turned on even while they're still back at the yards, and you can walk them down into the paddock. And then really what we are looking for is those animals to settle down in the paddock and start grazing nice and calmly. And as they do that, some of them will eventually come close to the virtual fence line, and we'll have the first one interact with the virtual fence. It will then receive an audio tone, and it won't know what that means, so it's very likely that it'll be followed by a pulse. And now the animal has a few choices at this point in time. It could either charge forward and go into the exclusion zone, but really the most instinctive reaction for that animal is to turn around and seek safety in numbers. So very often we see that they immediately turn around and go back to the rest of the animals which are inside the inclusion zone. However, it is possible that the animal will go forward into the exclusion zone, and if that's the case, then this is the scenario that might happen for an animal that continues to spend time in the exclusion zone. So it'll get the audio tone first, and then it'll be followed by a pulse. And if it still is in the exclusion zone, then that behavior will continue. It'll be another audio tone, followed by a pulse, another audio tone, followed by a pulse. So once these three pulses and audio tones have been delivered, then the neckband will say, okay, we haven't been able to contain you. We are going to let you go, and we're going to leave you in the exclusion zone with no further stimulus. So that animal is now free to spend time there without returning. Now, eventually it will come back to the herd, so it'll meander around a little bit and come back into the virtual fence. Note that it's always okay for an animal to return back into a fence. There won't be any stimulus, there won't be any audio tones or pulses at all. So it's always free to walk back across the virtual fence line to return to the inclusion zone. Once it does and the animal is back in, then the neckband will reset and say, okay, now I'm going to reinforce these boundaries again. So now if that animal comes back up to the virtual fence line, the neckband will start applying stimulus again. Now, if you're struggling to be able to find a training paddock that is appropriate, that doesn't have a very big exclusion zone, then there are some other options. We can set up a temporary electric fence to limit the amount of area that animals have in the exclusion zone. So you might set this electric fence up some way into the exclusion zone so that it doesn't represent a visual barrier for the animals. It's reasonably far away, but it gives them some space in an exclusion zone. But again, it just limits the amount of time that they will spend in this area before returning into the virtual paddock. So that's another option that you've got if you can't quite set up a scenario like this. So I hope that gives you a really good introduction on how to set up your virtual training paddocks and how to introduce your animals to it. See you in the next video. Bye.